Hey everybody. So here I'm going to be talking about a method that I proposed last year for how to make probabilistic inferences about the brains of long extinct animals. So here we'll be talking about, say, like a hominin, right? Like an Australopithecine. The idea is we don't have that brain and we will never have that brain, but we do have the inside of their skull. And from that, we can create an endocast. And the idea is can we take existing data and leverage it and teach a machine learning system to predict what an extinct animal's brain, like an Australopithecine, would have been like given its endocast, right? So here on the left, this might be the inside of your skull, the shape of the inside of your skull, your endocast, right? And then on the right there, that's your brain. So we turn those two things into numbers, and we teach a machine learning system to predict one from the next. Then we use my brain and my endocast and thousands of others to train that system. Then here, number two, we do it again with monkeys. We do it with apes. Maybe we use thousands and thousands of examples so that this machine knows how to go from an endocast to an actual brain. And then finally, we give it the endocast for something we don't have a brain for, right? Like an extinct hominin human ancestor. And we've used statistical regularities to create a system where the key is the endocast. And it's going to be able to make probabilistic inferences about what that animal's brain was like. So you can do that with dinosaurs. You can do that with just about anything. So the title here is How AI Could Be Used to Reconstruct Ancient Brains from Their Endocasts. So I've been wondering recently about the brains of extinct animals. This is addressed by a science called paleoneurobiology. Unfortunately, the soft tissues of these brains almost always decay completely without any traces of fossilization. However, we do, of course, have the interior of the skull for many extinct animals, from dinosaurs to the first mammals to our ancient ancestors. In fact, the inside of the skull is commonly preserved in fossils, and its geometry can give researchers modest clues about its previous contents. Scientists can use the hollowed-out brain cavity of the skull to make inferences about the brains of long-gone species such as the Tyrannosaurus rex and Homo erectus. The shape of this cavity can tell us a lot about the T-Rex brain, especially when we compare it to that of reptiles and birds. It tells us that the Tyrannosaurus had one of the largest brains of all the dinosaurs, and that it had large areas devoted to smell and sight. There are numerous informative details that can be gleaned from brain cases by trained paleontologists, but I suspect that many more details could be uncovered using machine learning. In this essay, we'll discuss how information could be squeezed out of brain endocasts. An endocast is a three-dimensional model or mold of the internal space of the cranial cavity of a skull. These casts are used in paleontology and paleoneurology to study the size, shape, and organization of the central nervous system of extinct animals. Here we'll discuss how we might be able to take an endocast, say from an Australopithecine, and make reliable guesses about its brain structure using AI. Of course, the interior of the skull is mostly smooth, and thus the endocast does not contain gross brain anatomy, but I'm going to assume that it holds lots of hidden information that's invisible to humans, but that AI could discern. So here we have a cross-section of a skull, and that shows the inside of the brain. So if you put a bunch of plastic in there or something to make a mold, and you pull that mold out, that would be the endocast. So here's another sagittal section of a skull, and then here's a horizontal section where you're looking at the bottom half of the skull from the top. Here's a chimp brain, other cross sections of skulls compared. Now this is what an endocast looks like. Alrighty, so I think we're ready to move on. The type of AI we would use would be a neural network like a 3D transformer model or 3D CNN, convolutional neural network. Such an AI system would be trained to look at endocasts and then predict what the corresponding brain should look like, generating plausible probabilistic brain anatomy. I believe that we can employ currently accessible or obtainable data to train such an AI system to do this. So there's a lot of the kind of data we would need that is accessible. But if we wanted to do a perfect job at this, we would need thousands of examples to do to really train this machine learning system properly. But all that information is totally obtainable. It just would take time and money. So during training, we would have to show the system many matched pairs. For instance, one pair would be your brain and your endocast. Then we could use mine, and then many hundred more. The best way to do this might be to use a CT scan of the inside of the skull as a proxy for the endocast, and then we could pair this with the MRI of the same brain. Perhaps 500 to 2,000 CT MRI pairs would be needed. We would have to give the AI hundreds of examples of these matched pairs to sufficiently train it to use the bone to predict the shape and form of the brain itself. Fortunately, much of this data has already been collected and exists in medical imaging datasets. Then we would collect similar data from apes and monkeys. Training on both humans and primates is crucial because it lets the system interpolate across evolutionary neighbors rather than just extrapolate. After training on this data, the system would be optimized to accept the endocast of a prehistoric human ancestor and produce a statistical 3D estimate of its brain. Cross-validation would come from leaving one species out of training and testing whether the model can predict its brain anatomy from the endocast alone. If it can reconstruct an orangutan brain without ever seeing one during training, for example, then it has captured a genuinely generalizable mapping. This AI system would use cross-modal learning to analyze the relationships between two data types, bone geometry and brain anatomy. This would use a form of supervised learning where the matched pairs provide the system with a question, which is the endocast, and the corresponding ground truth, which is the brain anatomy, to check its predictions against. During training, when the AI system gets things wrong, we would weaken the weights responsible for making the mistake, and when it gets things right, we would strengthen them, which is backpropagation by gradient descent. Over time, this feedback would optimize its ability to predict the brain by learning how the geometric features of the interior of skulls map onto brain anatomy. It would embed both skull interiors and brain anatomy in a shared mathematical space, learning the probabilistic mappings necessary to go from one to the other. It's important to remember that when the AI generates a brain, this wouldn't represent a single true brain, but a plausible reconstruction. Doing this many times would result in a range of possibilities that most likely capture many facets of the true brain. It could even do so while quantifying the uncertainty with confidence intervals. So one more time. Here at the top, we have humans. In the middle, we're using chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, gibbons. And like I said, we may hold out with orangutans and then add an orangutan endocast at the very end and compare it to the ground truth because we have orangutan brains. So we'd be able to test our system using that. So here in the middle, we have our neural network labeled as a brain anatomy encoder decoder, which is a 3D transformer. We could have two completely separate neural networks. One for the endocast and one for the brain, and just have them interface with each other. And the one for the endocast would be the encoder, and the one for the brain would be the decoder. But for the most part, they would use a 3D transformer architecture. Okay, to be analyzed by the computer, the endocast would have to be turned into a number using morphometric analysis. So that could use a 3D grid, a point cloud, or mesh. Basically, the geometry of each inner skull would have to be mapped, parameterized, and transformed into a long standardized number, encoded, that can be read into a neural network so that it can be compared with other such numbers. This digitization process would also have to be done to the brains. The brain and endocast would be trained to live in the same latent space via contrastive alignment. We would train this system on humans and other primates so that we could ask it to triangulate towards hominins such as Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and Australopithecines. This technique would work for any species where we have a fossil skull interior and living relatives. However, the more ancient the animal, the less fidelity the system will have. Trying to similarly interpolate the brain of a Tyrannosaurus rex based on data from reptiles and birds would be much more difficult, although I think possible. I think it would give some really interesting results. This is because the evolutionary distances involve hundreds of millions of years rather than just a couple million years in the case of our prehistoric ancestors. Nevertheless, using this technique on animals that have been gone for eons could still produce meaningful results. So here we have the inside of an alligator skull or its brain. This is a bird here on the right and a T-Rex at the top. So the AI would use an encoder-decoder architecture, where an encoder would turn the skull into latent code, and a decoder would turn the code into a predicted brain. This prediction would be a conditional generation or probabilistic model. The trained model would use transfer learning, generalizing knowledge about humans and apes to hominins, to accomplish allometric domain adaptation. Essentially, I'm proposing a form of geometric deep learning that uses morphometrics, which is the quantitative study of shape, volumes, curves, landmarks, to process information about non-Euclidean data involving meshes and point clouds. This system tries to build a latent space where skull endocast features and brain features line up, creating correlational structure. It would not rely on a single topological feature, but rather integrate hundreds of subtle shape cues simultaneously in something called multimodal fusion into nonlinear multivariate mappings. The system would embed both skulls and brains into a shared latent space, a kind of statistical arena where structural correspondences can be learned. Learning the brain endocast correspondence essentially involves a geometry to geometry mapping. So I think a properly constructed machine learning system will be able to create copious information from the endocasts alone. I think it will be enough to make predictions about gross brain anatomy and not just the brain's surface or the cortical mantle, especially if thousands of human and primate brains can be compared to their endocasts. Even though they look smooth, endocasts contain multiple overlapping latent signals. Humans have trouble integrating these diffuse features simultaneously, but a neural network can. This will allow it to learn non-obvious mappings, e.g. that a particular volt curvature pattern predicts relative cerebellar size. The endocast may be most informative for reconstructing the outer cortex that lies a few millimeters underneath it. But what about the deeper brain structures? I believe that by using full brains and detailed endocasts, the endocasts themselves might be able to offer plenty of information about the entire brain, including white matter and subcortex. Endocasts contain subcortical structures indirectly, and this means that with enough training data, a network can map endocast geometry not just to the outer cortical sheet, but to whole brain region proportions. Given sufficient compute and precision, I think it's possible that endocasts could even be used to make detailed predictions about connectivity or even fine-grained microanatomy. This could move paleoneurology from an interpretive art into statistical prediction of whole brain anatomy. Using not just the endocast, but the entire skull can contribute additional informative data, and may even be possible to squeeze information about the brain out of the full skeleton. So as a note, Australopithecine and T-Rex brains are gone. They're not recoverable because the soft tissue have decomposed millions of years ago. We will never see one and will never know if this machine learning technique is completely correct. But I think that this basic method, taken to the extreme with computer resources, huge computer resources, and lots of relevant data, could make accurate probabilistic inferences beyond what we currently imagine as possible. So again, it seems like there's not much here. There's not a whole lot of information here. But I think if we leverage it using machine learning, we'd be surprised. So let's talk about the landmarks on the endocast. And if you look at the whole skull, there's still so much mathematical detail that I think would help predict. I mean, even over here, which has nothing to do with the brain, right? This is the nasal cavity. There's still so much mathematical detail that I think would be predictive of all kind of neuroanatomical information inside the brain that we don't even have. So meninges, blood vessels, and cerebrospinal fluid all exist between the brain and bone above it, and so they obscure cortical contact with bone. Nevertheless, consistent signals remain. Endocranial volume, vault proportions, asymmetries, olfactory fossa, vascular channels, and gross lobe outlines. These are exactly the types of geometric data that machine learning excels at exploiting. The endocast can also give clues about the relative size and positions of regions of the brain, such as the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. However, the connection is weaker in the superior frontal and parietal areas. There are a great number of measurable endocast traits, features, shapes, curves, and metrics that can be extracted directly from the bony vault. And these include the things that you see here. So what could the results of a system like this do for science? For fossils like the Tong child, AI could sharpen our sense of which sulci impressions are genuine. For Neanderthals, it could provide a statistical measure of parietal expansion. For dinosaurs, it might offer credible intervals for sensory specializations. It's worth mentioning that a machine learning model like the one discussed here could be used on much more recent skulls. It could even play a role in helping to model the brains of deceased humans, such as, somebody's grandparents. Having a recreation of a loved one's brain could help make their AI counterpart or avatar more authentic. Realistically, this kind of thing should probably only be done with permission, but for instance, I wouldn't mind. And in fact, I'm granting my full permission to use my skull and brain for machine learning right here and now. By turning these cavities into data-rich predictions, AI could breathe new life into the study of extinct cognition and allow us to glimpse the hidden architecture of minds long vanished. While the results will always be probabilistic and uncertain, they could bring new rigor to paleoneurology, transforming endocasts into testable models of ancient cognition. The smooth surfaces of fossil skulls, long thought to be mute, may hold hidden records that only modern computation can translate. In doing so, we may begin to see not only the brains, but also the minds from worlds long vanished. Okay, so while we're at it, let me show you two other very similar machine learning systems that I kind of proposed here. This one would be for trying to understand what the body or the face of extinct animals would have looked like. So here we're using a hominin like Homo erectus, and we train this system on lots and lots of pairs of human skulls and faces. Or it could be skeletons and bodies, right? But here it's skulls and faces for humans, and then we do that for gorillas and orangutans and chimpanzees and maybe lots of other monkeys. So then we've created a system which the key is the skull. So we give it a skull for an animal that we've never seen before, like a Homo erectus hominin. And it would give its best probabilistic recreation of what that animal would have looked like without looking at any of the paleo art that humans have created. It would be able to offer its own depiction based just on photos and real skulls. Okay, and then here is another system that I hypothesized, and this is actually for DNA. So this is for Jurassic Park to bring back animals from the ancient past. And you could use this again on human ancestors, on dinosaurs, or on animals from potentially 400 million years ago. So you would train, it's pretty much the same setup, it's the same pipeline. Here you're using skeletons and DNA. So you start with DNA, which is basically already a number, and skeletons, which you use morphometrics to turn into numbers. And you give it a crow genome, and you also give it a crow's skeleton, and you teach it to be able to predict the skeleton from the genome. Then you do that with every species of lizard and frog and amphibian, crocodile, bird, and snake. And you first train it that way because that's what animals do. That's what happens in nature. You go from DNA to skeletons, right? But we want a system that can go from skeletons to DNA because we do not have dinosaur DNA, right? We only have their skeletons. Okay, so then we would invert the model and we would continue to train it on other pairs of data from various different species, training it to go from skeletons to DNA. And then let's say we held out on chickens. So it's never seen a chicken skeleton. So we'd give it a chicken skeleton and we'd see how good it is at producing chicken DNA. And we have chicken DNA, so we'd be able to make that comparison. So once we were confident that the system does really well, that's when we would insert a dinosaur skeleton and try to get probabilistic inferences even after 65 plus million years about what that dinosaur's genome would have been like. And I think that this is the best way to reconstruct the DNA of extinct species. And if you put all these things together, you have the DNA, you have the physical features and the heads or faces, and then you also have the brains. You have everything you need to start trying to bring these animals back to life.